agreed that if we give this to you, you have to wear it when you're in Iowa, okay? That's my only condition for this. It is a UNL Navigator shirt. Whenever that is. Could be 5 years from now. You gotta wear the shirt. It's my only request. Pleasure to see you. Thank you.
Hi guys.
Hi.
How are you tonight?
Good.
It's good to be with you. I think first time I was in Lincoln was 4 years ago already. So I was just kind of like having dinner at where was that dinner, guys?
I don't know.
Honest Abe. There you go. And so I just remember walking through Lincoln and just enjoying it. But then the last time I was here during winter was snow, and you guys don't have anything like this winter. But I've been enjoying my time. I've been here now kind of the whole day, and just looking forward to being another day with you and then doing tonight's talk. So yeah, I'm Laurence. I am originally from the Netherlands, and it's interesting because this whole missions video is kind of like, I'm part of that. I'm kind of like a European missionary to the U.S. Who would have thought that the U.S. would have need missionaries? And unfortunately, you guys are not an unreached people group, but at the same time, there is this space of where God is sending even people from outside of the U.S. to the U.S. Never realized that even for myself until God was bringing me here 5 years ago, and it's like, yeah, I'll send you here as a missionary too. What I'm doing, I'm part of our IS program, so it's kind of EdScore, but then internationally. So what I'm doing is helping send the U.S. navigators to the nations. And so I had some ISers in the Netherlands. That's kind of how I started connecting with the U.S. navigators. And they really helped us to launch our international student ministry in the Netherlands. So that's kind of what I'm thankful for the Americans in my country. So I'm originally from the Netherlands. My parents are actually from Indonesia, so that's why I'm not as blonde and Dutch looking as actually Jonathan ethnically is. He's very Dutch. But that's why I kind of like, I am Dutch, but you get the Asian front. But that's kind of like, what is this guy, this Asian guy saying that he's Dutch? But that's the reason why. There you go. So we're talking with Brian and about like what the content for tonight is, and we wanted to talk on sexuality. And I realized, and he told me, you guys had a really good presentation a couple of months ago, last semester on sexuality. And I think we wanted to go into a little bit more kind of the practicalities of it, and like how do we live with Jesus in the midst of our own sexuality and how we live with that. And I just want to show you this painting actually from Charles Mackesy. He's a British artist, and it's his kind of like painting on the prodigal son story. And I just love this painting because if you just look at it and just sink it in, just the intimacy between the father and the son when the youngest son come home. And I would say this is my story. So I grew up in a Christian home. So both my parents were immigrants from Indonesia before I was born. Both were from a Christian background. And specifically because they immigrated, they really had a deep relationship with Jesus because of that. I remember my own story is that I became very self-aware when I think about 10 years old. I was sitting in a classroom and just kind of realizing one moment, I'm Laurence, this is who I am, this is the body that I have, this is how I look like, and I'll never be someone else. Kind of like that whole existential kind of like awareness suddenly. And I kind of didn't like myself, coming to that conclusion, that I was just really hard time accepting myself. And I started to look to other people and other guys, kind of like, this is how I should look like, this is how it should be. And within that was kind of like the development of sexuality. And suddenly I kind of like, I think, well, not suddenly, but through the years in my teenage years, I just kind of like started having sexual feelings for other men. And I was really confused by that. I didn't know how to verbalize that, and I didn't have the words for that. And I was really struggling with that because I wanted to follow Jesus. I had this experience with him, a deep experience of his love, and he was the reality of kind of like who he was. But I was definitely kind of like thinking, I don't know I was just really struggling with that, my sexuality. And I came to a point when I was 17 years old that I kind of had to come out to myself. In a sense, I'm kind of like, okay, I'm gay. And that was the first time of realization of that. And I really thought that that would bring a distance between me and God. Because I thought like that realization, that's kind of like that breaks that relationship. But it wasn't. Because I realized, or not even realized, what I experienced during a time of like wrestling, just laying in my bed and just kind of crying out to God, that he was always there, that he was always present with me. And where I thought that my sexuality was the reason that he could not be present with me, that it was actually the opposite, that he was there. And where I thought that I needed to change first before he could embrace me, that I was embraced. And I saw and I kind of like learned that I didn't need to be transformed first before God could embrace me. Because he was already doing that. And I needed to experience this embrace. That the whole of me, that the whole of myself was being embraced by him. Even my own brokenness and sinfulness, as homosexuality, that I needed to be embraced in that particular place first before even any transformation could take place. And so the gospel came to me, for me, in my deepest guilt and shame that I experienced and sin, and that God was actually saying, yeah, you don't need to be transformed for me to come to you. And that is actually what this picture is kind of, symbolizing for me, telling me that story. That the only thing that I needed to do was come to him and cry out to him, and he was right there. And out of that love, I started surrendering to him. Because I have experienced his love so deeply for me in my deepest place, that I'm like, okay, if you can love me here, then I'm going to surrender my life to you. So surrender came not out of blind obedience, but experience of his love. And I think that's a challenge. I want to challenge you already at the start of that. Like, if you've never experienced that, not only that you know that he loves you, but that you know that he loves you. That is one of the experiences that, if we talk on sexuality, like, how can you ever surrender that particular part of your life if you have not experienced his love for you first in the midst of your own brokenness? But the rest of my journey, when I was 17, and further from that, and over kind of the last 2 decades, was for me, is kind of like, okay, how do I live life then? As having a sexuality, or being gay, or be same-sex attracted, whatever you feel comfortable with, but then living a life following Jesus according to what I believe his vision on sexuality became. I mean, I had to really learn that. But how do I follow him with my sexuality? And I think, and to have integrity with that, to have integrity with that. Because that's the word that I came up, I think, when I was started thinking about this, is that I don't want to talk about, like, how do we successfully accomplish and live life with my sexuality? But in the next slide, what is sexual integrity in following Jesus? And as you can see, I have like a little picture of Inside Out there, if you guys know that movie. Because we have so many emotions around this topic, right? And the emotions that this movie is portraying is like joy, sadness, fear, anger, and disgust. Well, hello, here we are, talking about sex and emotions around that. But how can we have integration? So I chose the word integrity because I'm not want to talk about like, this is the end goal. This is the goal. Well, I do want to talk about what an end goal is, but it's not about behavioral success, how I can accomplish certain things. There's also, I think, when we talk about certain principles here, I don't think it's only about sexuality. I think it helps us in our own integrity in following Jesus general. And then also it's kind of like in following Jesus. I don't want to assume that all of us who are in this room, who call themselves Christians, are following Jesus necessarily. And that's totally okay. I mean, sometimes we grow up in Christianity and we know about God's love, but we really need to experience that still. So that can still be your journey, and that's totally fine. So anything that I kind of want to present you, and even my story, is not meant to kind of like, especially on the topic on sexuality, to leave you feeling judged or saying like, I'm not good enough in that sense. But it's actually, and I hope that is true if we talk on sexuality, that it's something so beautiful, and that the way we follow Jesus is so attractive because it gives us fullness of life. That even if you're here and not sure about following Jesus, that it actually, what I'm sharing tonight will be like, yeah, this is so beautiful. I'm actually wanting maybe to take that direction and those steps. And you can keep me accountable on that, if that story of tonight is not moving you in that direction. So sexual integrity is integrating, for me, integrating what? What are the elements in our lives that needs integration and that we can have integrity in our sexuality? And I think it goes into 3 areas. It's in our convictions, what I believe. It's in our soul and heart. What do I experience? What do I feel? What are my feelings? And in our acts, what do I do? And I think you can experience that in the same way that I do, that walking this journey of life within our sexuality, that these 3 things in our lives are not always in sync with each other, right? That sometimes kind of like in following Jesus, 1 or 2 are kind of like, yeah, this is how I follow Jesus, this is my conviction about these things, but how I feel and sometimes what I do are just not in sync with that. And that's what I mean with integrity. How can we learn? How can we change or transform, even if we want to use that word, that these three things areas of our lives are in sync with each other, that they have integrity. Does that make sense? The fact that they're not always in sync with each other in our lives, can I just welcome you to the human race of believers and people who are trying to follow Jesus? That's a very normal thing. And the other thing that I also wanted to share in this is kind of like, we don't do this out of our own power. You cannot work hard enough to get these 3 things in sync, specifically on sexuality. I tried that. Just like, I would say, just give it up already. Don't do it. The only thing that we can do is surrender ourselves. What I did when I was 17 and said, Lord, I have no idea how to figure this out with my sexuality and following you. But I do experience your love so much, I'll just surrender to you and you can do whatever it takes. And I honestly thought that, he would just take my gayness away in that sense, and he didn't. But he said he wanted me to have transformation in a different way of like, what is integrity in this part, and how do you follow me? How do you follow me? How do you follow me, Laurence? With integrity on all these areas in your life. Do I want to be transformed in the way that he wanted me to be transformed? And so, again, this is not what I did. It's kind of walking with him by his Spirit and surrendering to the process that he brought me to. So let me zoom in these 3 things. Convictions, your soul and heart, and it's kind of like the principles I think I just wanted to share tonight with you. And first of all is the conviction. What do we believe about sexuality? And you talked about that last semester. And I think conviction can be something with like, a conviction is something that we believe that we're doing again with our head. Welcome to our enlightenment time. We're all kind of like influenced by enlightenment, but I think the conviction is specifically also meant in a kind of a biblical way, that it touches our hearts and desires, that it penetrates that. Because ultimately, I think that we're not intellectual driven people. We're not choosing, especially on sexuality, oh, if I just believe this, that will totally influence my actions. No. I think we're desire-driven people. And that's what we meant by God too. That if we have deep desires, that we will follow those. And so sometimes I think when we handle our own sexual brokenness, we don't really know what we desire. So we take just desire for less. I think it's C.S. Lewis. Like, if we don't know what we really want, we just desire the things that, and we don't even know what's better for us, for ourselves. He said it more nicer than that, actually. Somebody know that quote? What I'm kind of like thinking of? Anyway, doesn't matter. C.S. Lewis always beats me in that sense. So convictions need to sink into our hearts, that it really touches our desire, where it even touches our experience. Because I see this in our confusing world, that there's so many narratives out there on sexuality. And I just want to kind of like separate 3 of them that Julie Slattery did really well in her book, Rethinking Sexuality. And I just want to go shortly by kind of like, what are the convictions or narratives that are out there, and within ourselves too, on sexuality. So here's the first narrative, the cultural narrative, that your sexuality is an important part of identity and personal expression. And that growing mature in this, is that you are having sexual experimentation, and you are free of that because you're the boss of your own sexuality. And you just trust your own instincts. The sexual ethic and morality are just limited to issues of like, it needs to be consent, there needs to be consent, and we're not judging people for anything that they're doing or wanting. And it values, specifically in America, individual expression as more important than family or community. Do you guys recognize that? That kind of like narrative? The problems that we have is that it's not very consistent with a biblical worldview of creator, that God is a creator and he has the authority of life in every arena. It's not consistent with the view that that the human heart is broken. Not ultimately, that's not how God meant us to be, but that because of the fall, there's brokenness. And so how is then our sexuality also part of that brokenness? Because we see that brokenness and the harm in our culture and in individuals through pornography. There's gender confusion. We have a lot of broken families. And the whole movement of Me Too is a proof of that. So that's a cultural narrative. But then a lot of us who are from Christian home, we grew up with a purity narrative. And sometimes it's kind of like, which one is the chicken and the egg? Which is kind of like, which is the response on each other? Because I do think that the cultural narrative is responding to the purity narrative, and the purity narrative on the cultural narrative. Because here is what some of you guys who grew up in church have heard. Is that your sexuality is actually limited to sex within marriage. Single people should not be sexual. They cannot be sexual because they don't have sex, so you just have to wait. And if you're just single for a lifetime, sorry for you. You keep yourself sexually pure as a Christian is one of the highest goals you can have. If you keep yourself sexually pure, then God will bless you with a wonderful marriage and all the great sex that you can have in that. And if you don't keep yourself pure, that God still loves you, and there's kind of a plan B for your life. And maturity is all in this narrative is that you get married as a virgin. Any one of you guys familiar with that narrative? Problems of that is that we divide people into categories. Pure and impure. Pride and shame are part of that. People who succeeded and not succeeded. It doesn't acknowledge that singles are also sexual, and sexuality is more than having sex. And it's not very practical, helpful in dealing with real-life sexual issues, with pornography, sexual abuse, sexual problems within the marriage, And it's also not consistent with the overarching narrative of the gospel. So, I think what the purity narrative is saying to us, and I think that's one of the things that I wanted to go deeper into, is also like that every feeling and longing outside of being married is wrong. Or at least you have to feel bad about it. Sometimes we're asking people like, so do you have some impure thoughts? And some people would say, yeah, I have impure thoughts because I sometimes long to be, to have a partner, or I long to have sex. And I'm like, how is that impure? In the sense of like, the longing for itself is a very good thing. And we kind of like have not learned to say that to ourselves, or not as like saying it to ourselves, but to learn, to kind of like have heard that from the biblical narrative. And that's the third one, the third narrative. That the biblical narrative is that sexuality was intentionally created by God to be a metaphor teaching us about his covenantal love. I just want to kind of pause with that one. You can read the other three. That's the most important thing for us to catch. Sexuality is intentionally created by God to be part of humanity in its goodness from Genesis 1. That it is actually teaching us something about his love. And Paul is explaining that in Ephesians 5, where he says, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother, be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. So Paul is teaching us about sexuality, is that he says, the covenantal relationship between a wife and her husband, and how the husband is like committed to her for her cleansing and for her beauty, is exactly a picture of how Jesus is committed that through his bride, the church, us. And so even in the physical act of sexuality between a man and a woman, where the man has to come to the woman and she has to open up herself and her body so that he can come into her and give life to her. That is exactly a picture of how Jesus comes towards us, and that we have to open up our hearts so that he can come into us and give life to us. Right? Isn't that crazy to think about? How beautiful the act of sexuality is between a husband and a wife in a covenantal relationship, because that's also the reason why it reflects Christ and the church in the covenant that he made with us the most. And I know that sometimes our own kind of sexual sin and behavior and what we've seen in pornography and all of that has skewed that view. But that's then ultimately what God has been writing in our sexuality, even in our bodies, is his gospel. In how we use our sexuality is kind of like the gospel is written in it. And I think that's sort of the reason why he made it also that strong. And so, can you skip to that, to this icon, the red cross? This is the same one, but just a little bit closer. So this is a Catholic icon of Jesus on the cross, giving his body to his bride, the church. And so they call the cross even the wedding bed of Christ and the church. Because this is where he fully gave himself to us. And it's a reflection on our sexuality. Our sexuality, the gospel is literally, the cross is written in our sexuality. It's this beautiful metaphor. And the difference, I think, that we see also in the meaning of sexuality is it is the self-sacrificial love that Jesus gave himself to us fully. What we're using sexuality for in our world is trying to find self-fulfillment. That's what the cultural narrative is saying, is kind of like, I just find fulfillment, I just want to get off on you, you have to fulfill me. But honestly, purity narrative, American Christianity does the same thing. When you get married, you will get fulfilled. That's the promise. And that's an empty promise. And that's why I think we're all broken in our sexuality. It doesn't matter if you're straight or gay. Because the love, and that's what we were saying about even in the song, it's kind of with the love that Jesus has for us is self-sacrificial. And so how does our sexuality then reflect self-sacrificialness? And interestingly enough, for me, I realized that you can do that in marriage, self-giving love, and marriage is reflecting that, husband and wife. But I can also do that as a celibate single person. Because in how I can steward then my sexuality is not kind of to have sex, but to give myself fully in commitment to the church and to people around me in friendship and intimacy. And that's what it is meant to be. So that's, in that way, how I reflect Christ in the church as well. So married and singleness are now then on an equal level, even valuable, both valuable, and both reflecting Christ in the church. That's our biblical narrative. And that's why sexuality is so made in us so strong. Our feelings, our longings, what we're like dealing with on an everyday basis, even in our brokenness, actually shows us how much we long for Jesus. G.K. Chesterton, in a quote he's having, is like every time a man, can you put the next slide up? Every time a man knocks on the brothel door, he's actually searching for God. So think about your own sexual sin behavior. When you masturbate, when you watch pornography, when you are having romantic fantasies or watching certain programs that kind of like gets you desires up in your fantasy. What we are actually looking for. All of us, in some distorted way, we're looking for something, but ultimately we're looking for Jesus. So, the next slide. Your sexuality and sexual feelings are good. It is something that God has created in us to reflect himself. And it's meant to represent the gospel to ourselves and to others. That's the ultimate way to do that. And it's part of being human. And yes, it's broken. In our brokenness we sin. But sometimes I feel like because we're sinning and we're living in our brokenness and it has taken over, we have forgotten the ultimate purpose of it. And sometimes I feel like preaching the gospel of sex, we don't do that enough. Like, this is what our sexuality is about. But sometimes our brokenness, and that's kind of the second part of, so that's kind of on a conviction level, so this is important. But then we go into our soul and our heart level. And our soul and heart, we can believe the right things on convictions, but why do I still in my heart and feelings, it's so out of sync with that? And I think sometimes our heart needs to be healed. There is brokenness in there. And I want to make the distinction between the fact that our brokenness is not equal to our sin. Because the answer of the gospel to brokenness is that we need to be healed by him. We cannot repent from our brokenness. It's sometimes what has been done to us. It's sometimes just in our environment, where we grew up in. It's sometimes like, because of our brokenness, I use sexuality to fulfill something, to just tend to that wound that I feel. Does that make sense? That there's a difference in that? And so sometimes we can fight so much the sexual behavioral sin, but if we don't tend to woundedness, it just will come back. And this is then the way to kind of like ease that pain. The other thing that our soul and heart can experience is guilt. And we know that well, that we are like, oh, we are sinful, so we're guilty before God. But I think the dynamic of guilt and shame sometimes is very different, because shame is actually, the difference I would say, guilt is kind of like, we have done something wrong in our actions, and shame is like, I'm wrong. And what the difference is if I feel guilty, so I did something wrong to Zach here, and I feel guilty towards Zach, then what guilt does is kind of like, I want to make it right. Zach, please forgive me. I want to make it right to you. And I move into that relationship to make it right. But if I experience shame from Zach, and I've done something that makes me shameful, I actually want to hide. I don't even want to interact with him. I will avoid him. And isn't a lot of us where we kind of addressing sometimes our sexual sin just by guilt, but don't we experience a lot more shame sometimes in that? That we are ashamed about what our real feelings and thoughts are? And so how do we take care of our soul and heart? Where do we find healing and how does that work? And some reflections on this. The first one is, I just want to read a quote from John Eldridge from his book, Wild at Heart, that he says, the way in which God heals our wounds is a deeply personal process. He's a person and he insists on working personally. And for some it comes in a moment of divine touch. For others it takes place over time and through the help of another, maybe several others. Agnes Sanford says there are in many of us wounds so deep that only the mediation of someone else to whom we may bear our grief can heal us. And so much healing took place in my life simply through my friendship with Brent. We were partners, but far more than we were friends. Just spending time with a man I truly respected, a real man who loved and respected me, nothing heals quite like that. Healing never happens outside of the intimacy with Christ. And the healing of our wounds flow out of our union with him. And so kind of the next slide is that I experienced the healing of my heart and of my soul is experienced in community. Because even in my own deepest shame and in my own self-rejection, because that's what I discovered in my own bed and facing my sexuality, is that I thought that I couldn't be accepted by God, by others, because I just couldn't accept myself. And when I started to come out and be in community, and I saw how other people loved me and accepted me and wanted to draw me into Jesus and his relationship with him, I saw also that it's kind of like, oh, I don't love myself at all. But God loves me, and others love me, and I think I learned that God was really loving me in that place as well. And so the experience of community, and I think that's why we're also so relational, the fact that we come with our brokenness and our deepest things towards others and make them part of that, that brings healing to our soul. In some way we were made like that. And so I would say, like, how are you in that? Are you, sometimes we could call living in the light? Well, I mean, towards God, I'm always living in the light, because if he knows everything about me, he always knows that. But what 1 John is teaching us to me is that living in the light means actually that you are surrounded with a community that you are showing yourself with, in all honesty. And that is what it means to live in the light. And then you receive forgiveness, and then we receive healing in that part. Another thing that has really helped me to attend to my own heart and my own soul is the question of, like, okay, so I have all this sexual energy. And me as a single person, and some of you are not in a relationship, and then, like, how do I handle then my own sexuality and my energy in that level? And I just discovered that it's not that I say, oh, I cannot be sexual, I cannot have sexual feelings, but it's learning how to steward my energy for connection and intimacy, how I kind of wanted to rephrase that energy, in a certain direction, if that makes sense. And it's part of giving and receiving. And so one of the things that I've started thinking about is, like, okay, how do I connect myself deeply with other people? And I just started recognizing there's 5 areas of intimacy. There's a level of spiritual intimacy, so where we can have deep conversations about life and spirituality and God, where I feel really connected and intimate with someone. Second, I can have, like, an emotional intimacy, people that I feel safe with, to express my emotions, to cry, to be angry with, to be frustrated with, not on them, but that I can share that with them. Social intimacy is kind of like that you like to do the same things, that you like to play golf together, or go to Marvel movies, or to whatever. Eat together, cook together. And sometimes you can have like a really, and that's, I just kind of, you can have like a really emotional, intimate relationship with one friend, but not necessarily like the same stuff to do in a social intimacy, if that makes sense. And then I think the last two that can be confusing. Yes, there's sexual intimacy between people who are married, man and woman, but there's also physical intimacy that's not sexual. And one of the things that I discovered is kind of like, especially among guys, that we're sometimes not really good in that. But if there's the physical touch, and we are made by God in this body, that it's meant to be touched and to have physical intimacy, how do we are pursuing that? And I realized even in myself, I'm actually a pretty physical touch person. But especially because of like, I don't want to confuse myself or others, that I was really withdrawing myself between me and my other male friends, but that was not healthy for me either. And so how do I pursue a healthy intimacy on all levels except sexuality with my community? That became something of like, that was really helping me in my sexuality. But when I started talking with other people about this, is it really helpful in others' sexuality as well? Because what I also see is that if we keep it to myself, if I go into sexual temptation or sin, there's always something wrong on these intimacy levels. I can always trace it back to a lack of one of the four or more of that. And so instead of sometimes we're always kind of like avoiding behavior, this is the positive motivation of like, how do I pursue intimacy healthily instead of just avoiding sinful behavior? Does that make sense? I hope you recognize that. Just kind of like as a reference or extra comment in that, no one in your life can fulfill all 4 or 5 of them. If you expect your friend or your best friend to do that, if you expect your spouse to do that, too much pressure. That's also not possible. And so this is also a call for us to be in community with each other. And not only married people with married people and single people among themselves. This is especially a call to have a community where married and single people are also giving themselves to each other in this particular friendships and connection. Can we skip 2 slides and go to the vulnerability and humility slide? This requires a lot of vulnerability and humility. I just wanted to kind of like give these 2 words to you. And I'm walking this journey with my roommate, and we've been living together for 2 years now. Both have been going through, of course, COVID and a lot of rough things in our lives. And part of like our friendship is pursuing healthy intimacy. And he's straight, so in that sense, there's no sexual kind of like temptation for me in this or whatever. But we're really kind of pursuing like to be vulnerable and humble in the fact. And it's so interesting because I have such a good friendship with him, but every time I have to confess or kind of like come to a place like I'm really struggling with this, it requires vulnerability and humility. I have to choose that again and again and again. It's very interesting, that dynamic. But then every time we come to that place and pray together and pursue each other in that sense, I feel like there is this where I can have integrity, I would say, in my soul and heart and how I feel about these things too. Okay, the last thing is the actions. And so what is the goal here? Like, I think the goal of what we do in our actions is ultimately pursuing self-sacrificialness in all relationships. And that can look in very many different ways. So we can think in actions, oh, as long as I don't watch pornography anymore, as long as I don't masturbate anymore, I want to add something to that. How can we pursue self-sacrificials, giving ourselves fully to others? And again, we require transformation in that. So that's, I think, the end goal, but I do want to address, like, how do I handle then? How do I have integrity when I do sin? When I fail in my actions? When I do watch porn sometime? Or when I masturbate? Or even when I sleep around? Or anything that I actually, in conviction, I don't want to do, but I end up doing that because of my brokenness, because I just wanted to, whatever. But I want to follow Jesus. Lord, I'm so sorry. I just want to recognize again, it shows me how much I long for you. But how do I have integrity in that? And so, I would say that, how do you treat yourself? Can you go into this embrace? When you have sinned, can you go back to his embrace and his grace? And is that also without any time of penance? Because I recognize that. Oh, I've done something wrong. I have to wait for a week and be in penance and be in distance with him. So, because that's kind of the time that it requires. But can you jump back into the arms of the Father? I think learning, why do you go there? That you grow in your own self-awareness. That you know which intimacies you have to pursue. That you think about these things, and that you move into community and intimacy with others, that you have vulnerability and humility. And I think the last one is that you surrender yourself. If you really know the love of the Father, that you actually trust God for this transformation, the process of transformation. I mean, self-sacrificial love and acting around that is not automatically that you get there. It's a process of transformation, God changing your heart. And that you take time, and that you, again, that you don't have all the right behaviors there, but that you trust God for the fact that I'm going to surrender to this process, and you need to do it within me. So, 3 things for integrity. It is what we believe. It's what do I experience in my own heart and feelings, and what are my actions? Integrity in following Jesus means that we're sometimes out of sync, and we know that, acknowledge that, and we grow in our awareness of that. I think that's already a big deal, a big step that we can take. And then it's growing to me in kind of like, okay, God, I'm going to trust you for the integrity of myself. It doesn't mean that I don't sin anymore, or I don't do certain things anymore. But I grow in the depths of our convictions, our actions, and what's going on in our hearts. And we need community in that. Cannot do that alone. And it requires vulnerability from us. And a humility that we say, yeah, I do need each other. And so I think one of the things that we are, as navigators, and I know this staff team is committed to help you, us, ourselves, to pursue this. And me too. So tomorrow, if you guys want to talk a little bit more about this, I know that I have still some slots open to talk with you guys individually or in a little group to unpack this a little bit more, if that's helpful. Don't be shy. Feel free to do so. But let me pray for us for now, and then I think Gracie still has another announcement. We'll follow up this with Gracie as well. Father, I just want to thank you for who you are. Thank you that you are a God who created us with sexuality that is beautiful, that you meant it to be a blessing for ourselves to get to know you better. And it's a blessing for others, Lord, in how we reflect you and how we reflect your love for us. And I just want to pray for everyone in this room. Lord, it doesn't matter if we're already followers of you, if we don't know you yet, if we doubt you, if we struggle with our sexuality, Lord, and what we've done or our own experience right now. I just pray that all of us will experience your blessing over us and our blessing over our sexuality, and that you speak good words over us. And so I pray that you, in your love, just embrace us and can bring us to you, and that we want to surrender ourselves to you and to grow in this integrity, Lord, of our lives, including our sexuality, to follow you. And Lord, I pray your Holy Spirit over us for your transformation, to bring integration in our lives, that what we believe about you is syncing with how we feel and how experiences are, and that it reflects into what we do. And so, Lord, we entrust you for ourselves, for the process, that you will finish the work that you started in us when we came to you. And I just want to thank you for this crowd and for the navigators here. I just pray that you will bless us, Lord, and that we have openness in our conversations and in our relationships to really enter into the depths of our hearts on these matters. And I pray that in Jesus' name. Amen. Sorry, Macy.
Okay, so I'm Macy. I know most of you. Staff here at Nelson campus.
And I'm Tyler Cruz, and with the NavNight in Omaha, and also with Collegiate here at UNL in the region.
Yeah, okay, so if you were here last semester when we did our Shaw NavNight, we had like a little survey where if you just feel like God is stirring in your heart, that you're like, I need to take some steps forward in this area, whatever that looks like. We're going to do that again, but this semester we're doing something a little different, in that we're going to, well, do you want to flip the slide? No? Do you have a table of contents slide? Do you have a picture of a Bible study thing? Okay, so we're going to be starting men's and women's small groups. It's one of the opportunities on this survey. There's 3. And we're going to be going through a study called Rewired. And what that is kind of an 8-week Bible study booklet course that the navigators put together years ago and have updated in the time since. And it does a really good job of looking at kind of this overall view of what is biblical sexuality, how did it get so broken, what does faithfulness have to do with it, what is what do our relationships have to do with it, and just so many different topics. I was hoping we'd have the table of contents up here, but I don't know if we do, so that's okay. If you want to know each of the weeks, I can share that with you afterwards. But yeah, it's just going to be digging deeper into a lot of the things that Laurence talked about, including those 3 narratives. There's an entire week that's really digging into how have these narratives affected me personally. And so in this survey, there is that as an option of, yes, I'm interested in joining one of these Bible studies. I do want to make it clear that it is a bit, it's a bit of a commitment, and like Laurence talked about, a lot of this is vulnerability and humility, and so I fully understand that saying yes to this is a step of vulnerability and trusting God. And so that's something I would love for you to take a few minutes just to consider. Don't fill this out super fast. Think about it, pray about it. Because we do want these to be communities. And yeah, so Tyler's going to talk a little bit more about who
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Laurence, too. This is really just practicing a lot of the things that we talked about tonight. The beauty of our sexuality and how God created us to reflect Him and provide the church. And so we're going to talk a lot about why did God create us as sexual beings and the goodness of that. We're not going to talk about just the do's and don'ts, like Laurence said, but really kind of the heart behind it. We'll be getting into the Word, but we're also going to get into each other's lives too, in community. I think as we reflect grace to each other, we reflect what God is like as we share, as we confess. And this isn't just for maybe people who have maybe struggled, or but it's for anyone, because I think we're all broken in different ways. It doesn't matter what you've done or haven't done. It doesn't matter your sexual orientation. But like Laurence said in his own story, we can come to God just as we are. That's who we think we should be, but He meets us in the deepest places. So we're excited, even from our own journeys in this, and how we've really experienced Christ's love through things like this. So.
Yeah, so we want to just go ahead and have everyone scan this QR code, just so that there is, if you want to say, yes, I'd like to join one of these groups, there's no like awkwardness and being like, I wanted everyone's going to see that. Nope, everyone fill it out. I don't see all of your phones. Do it. Seriously. Everyone.
You want to talk to us too?
If you already did it, that's great. The other option that is on there is, if we also understand that maybe you're not in a place where you want to join a community, maybe that's not where you're at right now, and that's okay. Certainly some experiences, and yeah, we understand that maybe that's not where you're ready, or maybe you just have like one question and you'd really prefer to just talk one-on-one with a staff member. There's an option for that too. And then if you really feel that neither of those options are for you, there's a box for that. The last thing with this is there's apparently a raffle for filling this out for a $25 gift card to Buy Sandwich. So if you just fill it out and maybe get a gift card, do it. Okay? So Danny's gonna sing a little song. So spend some time reflecting, even if you just want to sit and think about what Laurence shared and pray, and then we'll end with some worship after that.
Yeah, thanks guys.